Growing up, it was easy to hear one simple explanation for why the Beatles fell apart. Yoko Ono did it. That idea showed up everywhere, in magazine pieces, on television, in the kind of offhand joke that becomes a permanent part of pop culture. But blaming one person for ending the most important creative partnership in modern music never felt honest. For men who had built something extraordinary together didn't unravel because of a single outside figure. The real story is messier, sadder, and far more human than that. By the time the Beatles publicly announced their split in 1970, they had been a group, with Ringo Starr behind the kit, for only 8 years. In that short span, they produced more than 200 songs, reshaped what popular music could sound like, and became the most famous band on the planet. To understand how it all came apart, you have to go back to the moment they stopped touring. Being adored by screaming crowds sounds like a dream for any musician, but for the Beatles by 1966, it had become genuinely unpleasant. Concert audiences were so loud that the band could barely hear their own instruments through the underpowered PA systems of the era. Ringo has described having to watch his bandmates' body language just to stay in time, since the noise made it impossible to actually hear the music they were playing, and admitted the performances themselves often weren't very good. John and George had grown weary of touring faster than the others. A particularly dangerous night in Cincinnati in August 1966 crystallized the frustration. A scheduled outdoor show had to be scrapped because of rain, after the band and crew realized the venue hadn't even accounted for the fact that they needed electricity for their equipment. The wet stage made performing too dangerous, and the show, their only canceled gig, was called off. Paul was the holdout. He genuinely believed live performance kept the band sharp and connected to its audience, and he pushed back against the idea of retreating entirely into the studio. But the rescheduled Cincinnati show, followed by an exhausting same-day trip to St. Louis for another concert in pouring rain, changed his mind. He later recalled the misery of that journey, crammed into an empty, sliding equipment van, as the moment he finally agreed with the others that touring life had become unbearable. Rather than make a dramatic announcement, the band simply stopped scheduling new tour dates and let the public figure it out. In hindsight, retiring from the road freed them creatively. Records like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band likely wouldn't exist in the same form if they'd still been playing arenas. But the decision also planted a seed. John later admitted that once touring ended, he began quietly imagining a future without the band, even though the thought of actually walking away terrified him. That private doubt, forming as early as 1966, would take years to become a public reality, but it never really went away. After a short break, John went off to film a role in a war satire in Spain, working on new material largely on his own, a sign that the band's once collaborative songwriting process was already fragmenting. That same period, he met Yoko Ono at a London gallery, though he was still married to his first wife at the time. When the band regrouped to begin what became Sgt. Pepper, Paul was the driving creative force, pitching the idea of the group performing as an invented alter ego band so they could experiment without feeling tied to their own public image. John and George reportedly weren't fully sold on the concept, but went along because no one had a better one. The result was a dynamic shift. Engineers on the sessions began treating Paul almost as the de facto leader of the recording process. Ringo, meanwhile, found himself with far less to do. The album's more layered, overdub-heavy production style meant long stretches where he wasn't playing at all. He has joked that he learned chess during the sessions simply to pass the time. George, for his part, later described the Sgt. Pepper sessions as tedious and increasingly joyless. He missed the earlier era when the four of them functioned as a working band rather than a slow assembly line of overdub parts, and he found himself losing enthusiasm for being a Beatle at all. Commercially, none of this mattered. Sgt. Pepper was a massive hit, spending months atop the charts on both sides of the Atlantic. But creatively and emotionally, cracks were already spreading beneath the surface. In August 1967, the band's manager and close friend Brian Epstein died of an accidental overdose. It was a devastating blow. John has said the loss left him genuinely frightened, since he doubted the group's ability to handle the business side of their own career without Epstein's guidance. The following year, the band traveled to India to study meditation, though John later admitted the trip left him unexpectedly depressed, and he returned to London ready to leave his marriage behind and begin a relationship with Yoko Ono in earnest. What followed is the part of the story most people already know. John began bringing Yoko to recording sessions, a real departure from Beatles tradition, since the group rarely let outsiders into the room, let alone offer creative input. During the sessions for the White Album, Yoko was around the same period, John and Yoko began using heroin, and John and Paul's songwriting partnership had all but ceased as a real collaboration. George was growing more confident in his own material, confident enough to bring in Eric Clapton to play on one of his songs, while the band's longtime engineer quit, citing the group's deteriorating behavior toward one another. Even Ringo briefly walked out, telling John directly that he felt shut out and unloved, watching the other three grow closer while he drifted. John admitted he felt much the same isolation. Ringo returned home after the others sent him an affectionate telegram, but the goodwill was a temporary patch over a much deeper problem. In 1968, the band launched their own record label, Apple, and tensions kept escalating. George, worn down by ongoing friction involving Yoko, clashed with John badly enough that some accounts describe it turning physical. George briefly quit the band outright, suggesting they simply replace him. John's response, needling George publicly and even floating the idea of bringing in Clapton as a permanent replacement, didn't help. They eventually patched things up, and not long after, the band delivered one of the most celebrated live performances in music history. Their impromptu rooftop concert in London, filmed for what became Let It Be. But the band's business affairs were unraveling. Apple was hemorrhaging money, and an accountant quit after warning the group that their finances were a mess. They needed new management, and here the group split along a new fault line. Paul wanted his wife Linda's father and brother, established New York entertainment lawyers, to take over. The other three refused, wary of putting Paul's in-laws in charge of the whole band's finances. Instead, John, George, and Ringo backed a hard-nosed music business figure who had a reputation even Epstein had avoided. He won the other three over with a combination of charm and deep knowledge of the band's catalog. But he treated Paul's in-laws with open contempt at their first meeting, effectively ending any chance of compromise. Paul lost the argument but refused to sign the resulting management contracts, a decision that would matter enormously later. By September 1969, the band had released Abbey Road, and the four were spending less and less time together as a unit. John, emboldened by having recently performed live with an outside group that included Clapton, was in a very different headspace than the man who, 3 years earlier, had reluctantly agreed to stop touring. So when Paul suggested, during a business meeting, that the band consider returning to live performance, John's response landed like a bomb. He told the group, in front of everyone, that he was leaving. Their new manager persuaded John to keep the decision private for business reasons, and John and Yoko left the meeting together. Yoko has since described John turning to her afterward and effectively handing her the emotional weight the other three Beatles had carried for him for a decade, a moment that, in hindsight, makes her role in the story look far less like the woman who broke up the band and more like someone